I was halfway through a treatment session, my hands on a patient's shoulder, guiding her through a rotation, when my phone buzzed twice against the desk behind me. On any other Tuesday, I would have ignored it. I didn't. The message was from my uncle's solicitor, a woman named Maureen Finch. 4 words, "Please call me today." The period at the end of that sentence felt deliberate. Final. I finished the session. I walked my patient out to reception, booked her follow-up, held it together through all of it. Then I slipped into the supply room at the back of the clinic. The one that smelled like rubber mat cleaner and old filing boxes. Leaned against the shelving unit, and called Maureen back. My uncle had died at 6 that morning. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis. He had told me 3 days ago not to drive up. He had said, in his measured, unhurried way, "You coming here won't change anything for me, love. Go do good work, that's what I need to know." So I had stayed in Sudbury. I had texted him every morning and wept alone every night, and done physiotherapy sessions in between. And now the phone was cold against my ear. And Maureen Finch was saying his name in the past tense, and I stood in that little room for a long time after we hung up. Before I tell you what followed, you need to understand what kind of family I came from. And I mean really understand it, because from the outside, we looked completely fine. My father built his career in commercial real estate development in Ottawa. Industrial parks on the city's edge, a few mixed-use projects that got written up in trade publications, he kept framed in his home office. He drove a car that cost more than my first year of tuition, and kept a box at the Senators' games that he used for client entertaining, and referred to, without irony, as a networking investment. My mother sat on the boards of 2 arts foundations and organized charity galas, and was very careful about which photographs of herself she allowed to be posted anywhere. They were the kind of people who had spent decades living very consciously inside a version of themselves they had designed and maintained. My brother was 28 months older than me, and had learned to inhabit that world without friction. He worked in wealth management in Toronto, wore the right suits, knew which golf course to drop into a conversation at which moment. He was good at reading rooms and adjusting himself accordingly. I used to envy that a little, even when I could see what it was costing him. I was a physiotherapist at a community clinic in Sudbury. I had a second-hand couch, a 13-year-old car with a rusting rocker panel, and a collection of houseplants that were, truthfully, not thriving. I had chosen this career because it required me to be useful with my hands and my attention, and because it kept me in the kinds of communities that hadn't been anyone's headline in a very long time. My parents called it a safe, limited choice. My father had said when I told him, "You want to be a therapist in Sudbury, that's your business." And then he had moved on to something else. The only person who hadn't moved on was my uncle. He was my father's older brother, 7 years older, a total gulf in temperament. He had left the family home in Nepean at 19, with not much more than a truck, and a willingness to drive it long distances in bad weather. He spent years doing transport routes through northern Ontario, then pivoted into timber supply when he saw where the work actually was. By the time I was born, he had built Halverson Timber Solutions into a company with a solid regional reputation, and a small, loyal team. His property sat on 42 acres outside Chelmsford, 20 minutes from where I would eventually choose to live. He had a heated workshop, a dock on a lake that froze solid every winter, and a garden that produced more vegetables than one person could eat alone. My father was embarrassed by him in a way he was too controlled to say directly. He called my uncle's success luck and his life small. He made comments about the truck in the driveway, the Carhartt jacket, the fact that there had been no degree. What he never mentioned, not once, in my presence, was that when his first major development deal fell apart in 2009 and he needed $85,000 to avoid a personal liability crisis, it was my uncle who wrote the check. No interest, no formal agreement, a handshake and his word. My father made partial repayments for about 18 months, and then that subject quietly disappeared from every conversation and was never raised again. My uncle never brought it up. Not to me. Not to anyone I knew of. I spent the summers of my childhood at my uncle's property. He taught me to stack firewood properly, which sounds small and is not. He explained that a good split follows the grain, that you read the wood before you swing, that patience in the preparation is what makes everything after it go right. He had a thermos of coffee that went everywhere with him, and a complete refusal to complain about the cold. When I was 15 and told him I wanted to work in healthcare, he didn't question it or suggest alternatives. He said, "Then learn how people work. Start with your hands." He let me shadow him in the workshop and explained every tool by name. He said that people who work carefully with their hands understand things that people who only work with words sometimes miss. When I was accepted into the physiotherapy program at Laurentian, my parents' response was a silence that communicated everything it needed to. My father said, "Don't expect us to fund that." My uncle sent a card. Inside it, in his slow, deliberate printing, "I'm proud of you, I'll help. Don't argue with me about it." And he did. Every tuition payment every year without fanfare or expectation. I kept that card in the outer pocket of my work bag for years. I still have it. The days between his death and the estate meeting were suspended and strange. I drove out to his property alone and sat in his kitchen, and didn't know what to do with my hands. The lake was dark and flat in the November light. His coffee thermos was still on the counter by the stove. My parents arrived for the meeting with the energy of people who had already made decisions. My father sat with his arms crossed and feet flat on the floor, a posture I recognized as his prepared to negotiate. My mother had dressed carefully, the way she always did when she wanted something. My brother had driven up from Toronto and spent the waiting period checking his phone. Maureen Finch's office was on the second floor of a low brick building on Elm Street in Sudbury. She had been my uncle's solicitor for 11 years and was precise and deliberate that she had anticipated almost everything that was about to happen in that room. She went through the estate documents methodically, the property outside Chelmsford, the business interest in Halverson Timber, the investment accounts, the RRSP. The total value, at time of filing, $2.9 million, Canadian. And then, she said the name of the sole beneficiary. Mine. The room shifted. My brother put his phone face down on the table. My mother's hands went very still in her lap. My father looked at Maureen the way he looked at contractors who had missed a deadline, with a particular kind of restrained fury he had learned to keep off the surface of his face. "Run that back," he said, and his voice was completely controlled. Maureen did not run it back. She turned her laptop around instead. My uncle had recorded a video. He was sitting in his kitchen, the same chair where I had sat alone just days before, and his face was thinner than the last time I'd seen him in person, but his eyes were the same. Steady and a little amused and completely present. He said, "Well, I suppose if you're watching this, I didn't make it to another spring. I hope someone remembered to check on the dock before the ice came in. I kept meaning to call Roy about that." He paused, cleared his throat. "I made this decision a long time ago and I made it with a clear head. I'm saying that directly because I know what certain people in this room will try to suggest about my state of mind. Maureen has the certifications from 2 physicians, so let's not waste each other's time on that." He looked to one side for a moment. "Douglas, you're my brother and I love you. But I have been watching what you do with money for 40 years. And I've been watching how you raise your children, and those are 2 different things. One of them I can live with and one of them I can't." He stopped again. When he continued, he looked directly into the camera. "Clara came up every summer for as long as I can remember. She drove 4 hours in February because I had a hard week and she didn't want me to be alone. She never asked me for anything. Not once, not ever. And when I tried to give her things, she argued with me. She chose work that matters over work that pays well, and then she made it work anyway. She is the kind of person I tried to be. So she gets what I built. That's the whole reason. That's all." The screen went dark. What followed in that office I will describe only in outline. My father's voice stayed controlled in the way that, I had learned over 30 years, meant he was closest to the edge. My mother raised the question of my uncle's capacity. Maureen addressed this without raising her voice or offering any particular sympathy. My brother said almost nothing, which was its own kind of statement. They asked me to come to my parents' house that evening. I went, because some part of me still believed there was something worth trying to salvage. There wasn't. My father had a document prepared, a family stewardship agreement, he called it. The estate would be managed collectively, with a distribution structure that gave me 30%. He framed it as protection, he said. "You're a physiotherapist in Sudbury. You don't have the background to manage assets at this level. We're not asking you to give anything up. We're asking you to be reasonable." My mother said, "Your uncle loved you." But he wasn't a sophisticated person when it came to these things. He didn't fully understand what he was placing on your shoulders. I looked at the document on their coffee table. I looked at the kitchen, at the countertops that had been renovated 3 times, at the wine rack, at the framed print above the fireplace my mother had bought because someone at a gala told her the artist was about to be noticed. I thought about my uncle's kitchen, the thermos on the counter, his printing on a card in my work bag. "No," I said. My father told me that if I walked out of that house without signing, I was making a choice. No holidays, no contact. He used the word estranged like he was doing me a courtesy by naming it cleanly. Then my mother said something I was not prepared for. She told me that my uncle had owed them money, that there was an outstanding debt that had never been settled, and they intended to file a claim against the estate. I didn't understand it in that moment, but that particular invention, that particular lie, was the mistake that eventually brought everything down. I drove to Chelmsford that night. I let myself in with the key my uncle had given me years ago, and sat at his kitchen table in the dark. Eventually I made tea, because it was something to do with my hands, and I sat there until the windows went gray with early morning. Maureen arrived at 8:30. She had a paper bag from a bakery in town in her briefcase. She had tried my phone all night. She said that when I didn't answer, she figured I had ended up where he would have wanted me to be. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and opened the briefcase and told me what my uncle had spent the last 3 years preparing. The first folder contained his journals. 3 notebooks, dated, written in his deliberate print. He had documented every financial transaction with my father. The $85,000 from 2009. An additional $40,000 6 years after that for my brother's down payment on a Toronto property, routed through my uncle's account because my father's credit was complicated that year. Neither amount had ever been repaid. He had noted dates, amounts, conversations. He had kept the bank records. The second folder contained a formal accounting from his personal accountant. A record of outstanding loans from the estate, relevant in the event that anyone attempted to file a counterclaim. The third thing Maureen showed me was on her laptop. My uncle had installed a security system on the property 18 months before he died. He had told no one. 4 days after the funeral, my father had driven out to Chelmsford with a key my uncle had apparently never agreed to give him. The footage showed him in the workshop for 22 minutes. He left with my uncle's surveying equipment, a transit level and a range rod that had been with Halverson Timber since the early years, and 2 boxes he loaded into the back of his car. My mother stayed in the driveway the whole time. My uncle had placed a copy of that footage in a sealed envelope with Maureen's name on it, 3 weeks before he died. He had written on the outside, "In case they do what I think they'll do." He had thought of everything. Over the next 2 days, the people who had been quietly waiting began to arrive. Stuart, my uncle's business partner of 16 years, came with the Halverson Timber files, organized into 4 clean binders, and a coffee he set down in front of me without comment. Agnes, who had lived down the road for 28 years and been my uncle's closest neighbor, came with 2 casseroles and one specific piece of information. She had seen my father's car pull into the property that morning, and she had written the license plate number in the small notebook she kept by her kitchen window. Because something had not felt right, and she still had that note. A man named Roy, who had been driving for Halverson for 9 years, and had been with the company since my uncle was still running routes himself, came because Stuart had called him. He sat at the kitchen table and told me what kind of person my uncle had been in the industry. That he had never once missed a payment to a driver. That he had quietly covered a crew member's emergency medical expenses one winter when the provincial coverage didn't move fast enough. That his reputation in Northern Ontario timber was built entirely on the assumption that Harold Halverson said what he meant, and meant what he said. And Maureen brought one more person, a retired magistrate named Gloria Fontaine, who had grown up 2 towns over from where my uncle had started his business and had known him, it turned out, since before I was born. She arrived in a gray wool coat and did not sit down right away. She looked around the kitchen slowly, and then she looked at me. "He called me 6 months ago," she said. "He asked me to be here if it came to this, so here I am." When my father and mother arrived the following morning, my brother was with them. They had retained a different solicitor overnight, a man who came with a folder of preliminary challenge documents and a manner calibrated for pressure. They were not expecting a kitchen full of people. They were not expecting Gloria Fontaine, who introduced herself by name, and waited while my father's lawyer absorbed what that meant. They were not expecting Maureen to open the first journal to the page, dated the week of the 2009 transfer, and set it on the table without comment. The security footage ran on her laptop. My mother watched it without moving. She had gone a different kind of still. Not composed, but trapped, the way a person looks when they are searching for an exit in a room that doesn't have one. Agnes set her handwritten note beside the laptop. Roy sat with his arms crossed and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Stuart placed the accounting of outstanding loans in 2 clean columns on the table. My father tried to perform. He raised my uncle's state of mind. He called the journals incomplete. He said the footage was being misrepresented. Maureen let him finish. Then she said, very evenly, that given the documented loans, the footage, the neighbor's contemporaneous record, and the family stewardship agreement he had presented to his daughter 4 days after the estate reading, she would advise that any formal challenge proceed through the courts, where all of this would become part of the public record. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that settles when everyone present understands that the argument is already over, and the only thing left is for it to end. I looked at my father. He was still holding himself in the posture of a man who is right and being wronged. but something behind his eyes had changed. He looked, for the first time that I could remember, genuinely afraid. "You came here because you thought I'd be alone," I said. "You thought that without your approval to stand on, I would fold. I spent 30 years trying to be worth noticing in that house, and the one person who paid attention was preparing this for 3 years while he was dying. Because he knew exactly what you would do. He saw you more clearly than I did for a very long time. I think part of you knows that. I think that's the part you'll never be able to say out loud." My father had no answer. My mother was crying, and it was different from any crying I had seen from her before. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was different. They left. My brother paused at the door and looked back at me, and I saw something move across his face that might have been shame, or something adjacent to it, and then he was gone too. The door closed. The room exhaled. The months that followed were the fullest of my life, and also, strangely, the most grounded. Maureen guided me through the estate process, with a patience I tried not to take for granted. Stuart walked me through Halverson Timber from the beginning. Not because he needed my involvement in operations. He was more than capable of managing the company. But because my uncle had believed that a person who owns something they don't understand cannot make good decisions about it. So I learned what it costs to run a timber fleet through a northern Ontario winter. I learned how a Crown timber license works and what it takes to maintain one. I learned why my uncle had always taken his driver's calls himself, instead of routing them through an office line. In his files I found something he had been quietly building for 2 years. A separate notebook, smaller than the journal's, blue cover, with notes toward a foundation. He had written, "Trade scholarships, Northern kids. People who work with their hands, that's where it goes." I established it in his name, the Harold Halverson Trades and Vocational Fund. Scholarships for students in Northern Ontario pursuing apprenticeships and trade certification. The kind of training that had been chronically underfunded for decades in communities where those skills were the thing that kept everything running. The first year, we supported 11 students. The year after, 19. I kept working at the clinic. I want to say that plainly. I kept my full caseload. I kept my Tuesday early appointments and my Friday home visits in the north end of the city. The inheritance changed what I could do for the work. It did not change why I had chosen it. When a patient needed adaptive equipment that provincial coverage wouldn't fully fund, I could close the gap quietly. When a family in a remote community needed sessions their insurance had capped out on, we found a way. The money was not something I was holding on to. It was something I was moving forward. I live in my uncle's house now. The lake is 40 meters from the kitchen window. And on mornings in late November, when the ice begins to form at the edges, the light does something to it that I have not yet found the right words for. My uncle's tools are still arranged in his workshop, the way he kept them. I have learned most of their names. I have learned how to split wood so it follows the grain. On Sundays people come. Stuart and his wife, Agnes, Roy, Gloria when she drives up from Barrie, Maureen who has become something between a colleague and a friend in a way I did not see coming. A rotating, imperfect, completely unperformative gathering of people who loved my uncle in different ways, and who have stayed connected to each other, because he held that connection in place while he was alive, and it is mine to hold now. These dinners are nothing like the dinners I grew up with. Nobody is tracking anything. Nobody is keeping score or managing impressions. We eat too much and stay too late, and argue about hockey, and talk about people who aren't in the room and laugh at things that are probably only funny if you were there. On those nights, when the kitchen smells like wood smoke, and whatever someone brought, and the cold is pressed up against the windows, I think about my uncle sitting in this same chair for 30 years, making the same choice every single week. Choosing who was at the table, choosing what that cost and paying it anyway, without making anyone feel the weight of it. That is what he left me. Not the property, not the accounts, not the business. He left me the proof that how you treat people, quietly, consistently, over years when no one is watching, leaves something behind. Every fair deal he made, every payment he honored, every person he helped without requiring them to feel the debt of it, came back. Not to him. He never needed it to come back to him. It came back in the form of a retired magistrate who drove 2 hours on a November morning, and a neighbor who had kept a note in a kitchen drawer because something had felt wrong, and a driver who had been with the company for 9 years and showed up without being asked. Real wealth is not what you protect. It is what you build in people, so that when you are gone, they carry it forward on their own. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, if you know what it is to sit at a table full of people who look past you, I need you to hear this. The people who actually see you are out there. Sometimes they are not who you expected. Sometimes they are the quiet ones, the ones who show up without announcement. The ones the rest of the world has not decided to pay attention to yet. Don't spend your life trying to earn something from people who have already made up their minds. Find the people who call in the hard weeks. Find the people who write it down and mean it. Find your Sunday kitchen. If any part of this stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me about someone who saw you when others didn't. I read everyone. And if you want to hear more stories, subscribe, there's more to come.